Hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com here with a virtual luncheon. We're going to take a look at the state Supreme Court race, one of the top races in the country this spring, and which will be deciding the ideological balance of the court. And this event today is sponsored by the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you to the Thompson Center for being a sponsor of this event. Now we have some upcoming events I want to tell you about before I introduce the program today. These are in-person events though, but you can find out about them at WisPolitics.com. On February 28th, we have the Joint Finance Committee co-chairs at the Madison Club. On March 16th, we're doing a clean energy event at Discovery World in Milwaukee. And on April 6th, we have Charles Franklin, the Marquette University Law School pollster, who will be talking about this very race, and he will be at the Madison Club. So I want to welcome in our panel today to talk about the state Supreme Court race. And I want to welcome in Matt Smith. Matt Smith is one of the co-hosts of UpFront. UpFront is on WISN-TV and statewide, and WisPolitics.com is a partner in the UpFront program. We have Corri Hess, who covers politics and government for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome, Corri. We have Chuck Qualla, the former Senate Majority Leader, who is one of the insiders. And the other insider is Scott Jensen, the former Republican Speaker of the Assembly, who has in one of his lives, managed a lot of Supreme Court races. So he can bring that experience here. So this race is already extraordinary in the amount of money being spent. $6 million, north of $6 million from all candidates and groups combined. The biggest of that, about $2 million from Dick Uihlein's PAC, which is backing Dan Kelly. Then we have about $1.25 million from Better Wisconsin Together. That's a liberal group which is running ads against Jennifer Dorow, the other conservative. And then we have Janet Protasiewicz, the Milwaukee County Circuit Court judge, who is lapping the field in terms of her campaign fundraising, and she's spending north of $1 million. The most expensive Wisconsin Supreme Court race, according to our research, is $10 million, about $10 million in from all sources in 2020. And the most expensive one in U.S. history, according to our research, is 2014 in Illinois, and that was more than $15 million. So we're well on our way to breaking a bunch of records here. Let me just start off with you, Corri. You've written about this spending at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. What does this tell you about this race?
Well, I mean, the amount of spending just shows how important this race is. It's supposed to be a nonpartisan race, but this race will really, it has the potential to change the outcome of the court. Right now, the court leans 4-3 in a conservative majority. Depending on who wins, it could change the ideological makeup. And the court's got some big cases ahead of it. They could be voting on abortion. They could be talking about the state's election maps. And so there is a lot of big money going into this because it's not a nonpartisan race when it comes down to it.
Right. I neglected to mention the fourth candidate race. Sorry, Dane County Circuit Judge Everett Mitchell. He has not raised a lot of money, and but he is in a race. So 4 candidates on the primary ballot. The top 2 will emerge, so emerge for the April race. Okay, let's go to you, Matt. What does all this spending tell you about this race and the state of the race?
Well, listen, I think there's 2 groups that are not complaining about this. Wisconsin TV and radio stations are sure not complaining about the spending that we're seeing now, and then even the increase we're going to see going into April. Listen, I've talked with all 4 candidates for UpFront, Jeff, as you know, and I asked a lot of them about the spending, about the money. And they all say, listen, we welcome the support, whether it be from outside groups or whoever. But if there's this outside group like Dorow, for example, that's attacking me, we don't want that spending going on. So, if it's going to benefit them, they really like it. And if you look at Protasiewicz, for example, her last report, like nearly 300,000 of her 725 came from out of state. That just really highlights at this point the national importance of this race. Yes, granted, it's 2023 and there's not a lot to talk about in terms of other races, but it also is symbolic of how state Supreme Court races have become even more important, I think, in growing years when you look at the state level and the national conversation among both of the parties.
Right. Another plug for WisPolitics here. If you want to know about the candidates and how to reach them through their websites, you can go to WisPolitics.com, and we have a primary election guide. Scott Jensen, the former Republican Assembly leader, I want to ask you about this, how these races became so partisanized. My memory is the Republicans nationwide made it a goal to win these races, that it was important for for redistricting and all these big issues. And so they made a national effort to do it, and they have ruled the court here for about 10 years. So give us a little scope of history here, and then what this big spending tells you.
Absolutely. I mean, the spending in this race is going to be incredible. In the first Supreme Court race that I worked on in the 1990s, we spent less than $200,000. So you had a statewide race where one candidate spent like $180,000, the other one spent $140,000, and that decided the whole thing. There may have been a week in this race when Judge Protasewicz spent more than that herself. So this is an extraordinary jump here. It's also a different kind of money, right? So most of the money early on was the candidate. The candidates dominated the message because they were portraying themselves to the public. Now, most of the money is spent by outside groups. Much of the money is also coming from outside of Wisconsin. So all that is transforming the character of these races. The stakes did become big. I think in 2000 was probably shortly after that was the first time that Republicans began to sort of actively engage in the races in a partisan fashion. And not long after that, Democrats joined in as well out of necessity due to competition. And it also used to be that people would try to telegraph messages by saying, take a look at the people I have supporting me. That will tell you where I am on these issues. And we have now clearly with Judge Protasewicz, we've now gotten in there where she's just going to tell you how she's going to decide these cases, rather than hinting that I've got the support of a pro-choice group or a pro-life group or law enforcement or not. I mean, that's sort of a startling development, I think, in this race as well. So these have gone from nonpartisan. In fact, they were sort of bipartisan affairs in the 90s. Quite often we would get a Democratic governor and a Republican governor to endorse a candidate for Supreme Court. That is long gone here in this race.
All right, Chuck Hall, the former Democratic leader in the state Senate. Chuck, what's all this money tell you about this race and about the arc of state Supreme Court races in Wisconsin?
Well, it's changed dramatically, and we're a long way from nonpartisan races, which were decided on little dollars, as Scott pointed out. This has huge national implications. And by the way, the biggest secret weapon that Janet Protasewicz has on her side is Ben Wickler, who's the head of the Democratic Party. And he has done an amazing job of fundraising for Democrats across the board. But he has also sounded the alarm bells nationally to Democrats that this race needs to be run. And frankly, for anyone in Wisconsin who wants to have a chance to vote for a legislature that might tip to the Democratic side, this is the only way you're going to get it. Because between the gerrymandering that's been done and what the Supreme Court being controlled by Republicans, there will never be a competitive legislative race where you can choose whether they'll be Democrats or Republicans unless the Supreme Court has changed. So I think both the reality of the importance of this race and the Ben Wicklers and the Republicans of the world who are dominating this, will be dominating this race. The money has become huge. The impacts nationally are huge. And I think that you are going to continue to see that across the country, but in Wisconsin for many years to come.
All right, I want to talk about what Scott talked about is Judge Protasewicz really just sort of going out there on issues. I mean, in particular, we had a forum back in early January. She said the maps are rigged. Okay, and then shortly thereafter, she said her value is how she phrased it. Her values are that abortion rights for women should be the law of the land, that the Roe v. Wade was a bad decision. Okay, so let's just talk about it. Matt, let's just start with you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I guess it depends on who you ask, right? If you're a Democrat or Republican. And when I talked with her, because you're right, Jeff, she's really talked about values a lot, and that's how she's framed her position and essentially trying to equate it to how she would rule. So I asked her multiple times, well, how do your values dictate how you rule, and how do they play in and factor into how you may rule on a given case? And she said, well, yeah, you can't necessarily remove your values from your decision making, but you attempt to, and you follow the law and you follow the Constitution, so read between the lines. A lot of people have, and a lot of people are doing it. It is a campaign approach, a strategy approach. I think coming off the midterms, when Democrats saw that the abortion issue did well for them, when you look nationally and here in the state, and to Chuck's point, you look at the party infrastructure behind the scenes, the Democratic Party here in the state, the Republican Party here in the state, they kept staffing on after the midterm elections to get them through April, which signifies that you just think about how massive the midterms were, right? In Wisconsin, battleground Wisconsin. Well, if you keep that infrastructure in place for an April Supreme Court election, that just really highlights from the national down to the statewide level, the resources that we're not even seeing behind the scenes that are going to these campaigns, doing the door knocks, doing the lit drops, all of that stuff that's really intensifying as we sit here today.
Yeah, Corri, I mean, Judge Protasewicz's values certainly are strategic as well, because, the abortion issue has staying power, right?
Yes, I agree with Matt. I think that the abortion issues, it's really sticky for the conservatives. I mean, I think it was something that actually it hurt Tim Michels in the governor's race. He came out in different ways with it. First, he was, absolutely not. And then he changed and said, in instances of rape, he could bend. And I think it's sticky for conservatives. I mean, even I've heard Judge Doro talk recently at an event, and she was asked, and she said, she went along the lines of Rebecca Clayfish, where she is a mother and a woman, and she feels, for women, but, she's got to let the law and the legislature, and it's hard. And I think that Judge Protasewicz knows that where liberals and Democrats land on this, and she has that advantage. And so I think she can say these are my values, and she's not afraid to say that, even though the conservatives, she knows she'll be attacked for it.
Right. And, to that point, Emily's List, which supports pro-abortion rights women, female candidates, has endorsed Protasewicz in a state Supreme Court race, an unusual thing. All right, Scott Jensen, how come the legislature hasn't provided cover for Republicans who are on the ballot on this issue?
Yeah, I don't know. I would say this. I think the Democrats have done a really good job with this campaign. You're seeing the two liberal candidates are not shooting at each other. You're seeing an incredible amount of money coming in to help the Democratic candidates. The liberal candidates have money behind them that is being, they're attacking the two Republicans or the two conservatives in this race. In particular, they're attacking Jennifer Doro. So Jennifer Doro came into this campaign as the person with the most name ID because she was involved in a trial that was internationally watched, and she got national attention and respect for the way she handled that case. And so she came in late, but she was by far the best known person at the start of this race. So she didn't necessarily have to spend as much money as everybody else, but Protasewicz is, I think, probably as well known, if not better known now than Doro. And they've all been hammering Doro Kelly, Dick Eline's money, Protasewicz, the liberal money, all of it's been going at the moment. It's about 4 or 5 to 1 against the amount of money that Jennifer Doro is spending promoting herself. And that is going to change this dynamic dramatically in the race. So she may have started out with a first in the polling or whatever, but that is no longer the case. This is going to be very tight. I don't know if Doro can survive. When you're spending $1 million or less and you got $4 or $5 million pounding the crap out of you around the state, I don't know if you can survive that, even if you kind of struck a chord with people all across the country during the course of that trial. I just don't know that you're going to be able to hang on to that reputation after all that negative advertising.
Okay, so, well, I guess what you're saying is Protasewicz is going to get through the primary, pretty sure. She's spending all sorts of money and there's not really much negative against her so far.
So there was a chance where there could have been 2 conservatives making it through. That's not happening. I said that 2 months ago. That's clearly not happening. Protasewicz is the only one with a golden ticket so far. And the 2 conservative candidates are fighting it out. I think it's going to be fairly close because Dan Kelly's resources, thanks to other people's money, are much, much larger than Doro's.
Right. Okay. Chuck, when Chuck and Scott do the insiders, that's a video podcast that we have at WisPolitics, and you can find that and see their sparring. Chuck, throughout the fall, I think he said abortion rights probably 1,000 times. Maybe that's an undercount. So, I mean, what's the staying power of this issue in a court race, Chuck? Why will it have so much effect in a court race?
It will decide the race this year. Corri mentioned it in the first moment that she got on the video here, saying that abortion is the issue. Well, not directly, but she raised that as the issue. By the way, I agree with Scott's analysis. And by the way, I have my sources tell me that Protasewicz is #1 and that she's going to come through the primary. She will probably win the primary, and I think she's going to win the general election going away. And why will that happen? I think the reason that she is where she's at is not frankly her money. It's where she's at on abortion. But that issue, women just are not always going to articulate this. But as I talked with women in the fall, they are pissed, and rightfully so. The Supreme Court, there are 2 nominees to the Supreme Court who people feel lied to the Senate when they were getting put on, and they changed their votes and voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. By the way, I've listened to their testimony. They did not lie. They were good lawyers and parsed their words. By the way, that's why people hate lawyers. And remember, I'm a lawyer here. But the bottom line is abortion is going to decide this. That's why Emily's list is on board with this. This is why it's going to change. Watch what's going to happen in the Milwaukee suburbs, both in the primary and in the general election. This is an issue. And to take a step back from all of the other things going on here, but what's driving the money? Why are Democrats able to do this? It comes back to one thing. It comes back to abortion. Republicans made a decision. Ronald Reagan was a pro-choice Republican in California as governor. In the 1980s, the Republicans decided to turn this into a partisan issue. Even George Bush, the senior, had to change his view to become pro-life. Every Republican has to be pro-life. They are now the dog that caught the car. It's going to drive this election and probably the 2024 election. And Republicans are in deep trouble.
I think there's been an interesting, the Democrats have been very successful in changing the issue constellation in this race. Historically, in a Supreme Court race, it's your judicial experience and who's got law enforcement support. And Doro's trying to make that the issue. It's not going to be the issue in this race. They have successfully changed the constellation so that people are talking about abortion and redistricting, and that's the way they're going to do turnout. Redistricting is not going to work for turnout, but abortion will work for turnout. And it's just a completely different issue constellation than we've ever seen in a Wisconsin Supreme Court race.
Okay, so Matt and Corri, you're both, stationed in Metro Milwaukee, and that's your, major coverage area. But I'm just wondering about this battle between Kelly and Doro, Scott, the way he painted that. And that seems to be a coin flip right now. Let's go through, Corri. Maybe you can just say, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the 2 candidates, and then Matt, I want you to add on to that. Let's go to Corri first, and on comparing Kelly and Doro.
Well, I mean, as a, I think that, the battle really has been Judge Kelly going after Judge Doro. It started, I mean, I saw it first in Greendale a few weeks ago when Dan O'Donnell asked, are you guys willing to support each other because of what happened in the primary for governor? And then it really just split. It didn't work for, I don't think it worked for Tim Michaels because people liked Rebecca Clayfish. And then just in my opinion, I don't think that the Clayfish supporters got on board with Tim Michaels. So that's kind of how he framed it. And so Jennifer Doro said that she would support Dan Kelly. And then he just said no, that Judge Hagedorn had disappointed him and that he wouldn't support her. And then, he's been just taking it further and further. So he first said that, let me get on Judge Hagedorn. And then he has since questioned her, her judicial intellect. He's questioned, well, they both, they're both kind of fighting over who's conservative enough, but she doesn't respond. I've asked her several times to respond and she doesn't. And now he's saying his latest thing that he has said is that he's the one that can bring in the most outside money. If she wins the primary, she can't. And so it's actually been really interesting to me because, like Scott said, he thought a couple weeks ago or months ago that there could have been 2 conservatives on the ballot, which seems like something that they would have wanted to do. But now I don't think that's at all a possibility. So it would have seemed like maybe they would have tried to work together and then after the primary gloves come off, but I'm not a politician.
Okay, just for some background in case people don't know it. So Kelly was on the Supreme Court, appointed by Scott Walker, then lost to Jill Karofsky, a couple years ago. So, he's looking to get back on the court. And his disappointment in Brian Hagedorn. Hagedorn is a former Scott Walker, worked for Scott Walker in the Gov's office as legal counsel, and then was appointed a judge by Scott Walker. And he has, even though conservatives control the court 4-3, Hagedorn has strayed from the conservative line on some big issues. Okay, so Kelly doesn't like that. He wants everybody to be in line on that. All right, so Matt, what about this battle between Doro and Kelly? I'm not sure we would have predicted it would have been so testy, right? But certainly it is.
Yeah, and there's some Republicans I've talked to who are getting a little nervous, right? Like if Scott, right? Like if Doro makes it through, what in the world is going to happen, especially with how Kelly has positioned himself, at least leading into the primary? I think the parties, right, like always have this internal debate, and or at least we talk about it a lot, is like Democrats, do you coalesce behind one candidate, put all your resources, all your money, all your support, or is it more healthy to have this competition in the primary, to have this healthy debate and primary among your party? And right, to be determined on who is right on that answer and what party is right on that answer. But I think the governor's race is still lingering in a lot of minds for Republicans, and they're starting to see some mirror images just in how that may shape out or play up coming out of the primary, depending on whether Kelly or Doro wins. And Jeff, to your point, Kelly keeps going back to Hagedorn, right? Like, we thought he was going to be this judicial conservative, and look what he did. And then he then raises the question about Doro. Well, we don't really know what she's going to do on a statewide level. He goes back to his time on the bench, trying to make the point that he is the conservative that they can trust. And there's just a lot of question marks around Doro. At the same time, I've had Republicans more privately than publicly, I think, tell me that a candidate that lost by 10 points a couple years ago, I mean, that's a landslide in Wisconsin. So there's some nervousness about Kelly getting through, and there's also some nervousness about Doro getting through and how all of that's going to play out in the coming weeks.
Wasn't that the whole reason that Doro was encouraged to run? Because Republicans were skeptical that Dan Kelly could pull it off. Now, I know comebacks are hard in Wisconsin politics. So anyway, Scott Jensen, you've been nodding your head. So are we to draw the parallel between the governor's race and on the Republican side and this race on the Republican
Well, I
side?
think one of the things people walked away from the last governor's race is that, whoever wins, we all got to rally around and support that person. And I think people are, Republicans are startled to hear Dan Kelly say, I don't think I'll think about it. That's just like not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to let the people decide who our standard bearer is, and then we all rally around that person. And so I think that was actually damaging to him when he sort of arrogantly said, I don't know if I can support her in the general election. And to question her credentials, she's been a judge longer than he ever has been. I mean, I just think a lot of that campaign has been personal and negative, and I don't know that that's going to help him, except that there's so much money being spent dragging Doro down. It's pretty hard to survive a 4-to-1 negative thing versus positive, unless it's just she struck such a hard chord with the public during that trial that nothing's going to shake them. And I think that's actually possible here. When I talk to people in this area of the state, I'm amazed at the people who are standing up for talk radio. They stayed neutral in the Republican primary for governor, but that's not the case here. They have been very critical of Kelly for the way he's running this race, and they have defended Doro for every attack that's come back to her, and that will still matter to primary voters in this part of the state, at least in Metro Milwaukee.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry if I could jump in. One thing that's been interesting is Brian Hagedorn has not commented, but other justices, Supreme Court justices, have jumped on and criticized Jennifer Doro as well. Scott, have you ever seen that before?
It's there has been criticism in the past by even among the liberals. We had a break back with the former Chief Justice was criticized by other members of her court. So that would have been 20 years ago, probably. But what I'm kind of amazed at is there's a I won't even give her name up, but there's a Court of Appeals judge here who has, I think, destroyed her reputation. Someone who I voted for has destroyed her reputation in her efforts to try to get involved in this fist fight. And I'm just like, wow, why are you, why would you do that? But she has embarrassed herself on talk radio in Milwaukee and on television. I just am amazed at how personal this has become. And the Democrats in the end have been very smart. They essentially let the money people and the leadership pick their candidate. They protected that candidate, and they have been hammering the two conservatives throughout this. They have played their cards very well. I do not think conservatives have.
Okay, so Scott, why aren't you mentioning Judge Grogan's name?
Because someone else was sure to do so.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I let the cat out of the bag. Okay, have you endorsed in this race at all, Scott, the state Supreme Court race?
Who would want my endorsement? No, I have not endorsed in this race. No one's asked for it. So.
Okay, and Chuck, have you endorsed in this race at all, or backing a candidate?
No, but Jeff, let me get in on this. I know I'm the Democrat here, and I probably have smiled more in this event than I have at any other event we've had. But this is bowl of popcorn time for Democrats and progressives. Oh my God. Let's just watch the cat fight continue here. Oh, you've got to be kidding. I mean, you've got on the one hand, coming through the primary, proven loser. And as others have pointed out, a proven loser by 10 points. Kelly is not going to survive in the general election. Problem for the Republicans now is that as we see things coming out on Doro, several problems, huge baggage, decisions, entities she's represented, a firm that takes on child molesters. Oh my God, it's awful. Other things, personal, which I'm not even going to touch on. But also, here's what we saw at the first debate, which WisPolitics put on. She could not make her own arguments. She had to refer to a list that had been prepared for her in advance. She can't make the arguments. I mean, Corri was kind of alluding to the fact that she won't respond. Part of that is because her handlers are telling, they have seen, oh my God, she can't function. That is going to be disastrous in the one debate that they're going to have. So for Democrats and progressives, they look at this and say, this is a winner. By the way, let's be clear about this. This fight whether we want to fight or not in the primary. No, you don't want to fight in the primary. And the problem that Doro is going to suffer from is she's going to lose certain votes in Waukesha and elsewhere because of the attacks from her opponent. But the other thing is, because she's having to defend herself as being the ultra conservative, she is going to lose some suburban votes because women in the suburbs feel betrayed by a court that says, we believe in you making decisions for yourself. We believe in small government. Oh, but when it comes to the most personal thing in your life, we would like to decide whether you get treatment for that miscarriage, or did we think it was really an abortion gone wrong? We are the ones who will decide when it's appropriate for you to have a child who has spina bifida or something. Oh my God, folks, this is going to be a wipeout. And for all the reasons Scott cited, and for the reasons I've cited, not only the primary, but the general election is going to be quite a day for Democrats or progressives.
Yeah, obviously in the general, I disagree. If you look at just Judge Protasewicz's record, that's like an opposition researcher's dream. There's so much material in there, and she will look completely different when this race is done. I think the one thing that we can't quite assess about Doro is the value of that trial. People saw her in action, and there's no filter there. It was live. It was live on the radio and television in this part of the state. And boy, can the ads undo that? Can the campaign undo all of that? I don't know. It's an organic asset that she has in this campaign, and it's just hard to value that compared to all the money that's being spent.
And Scott,
Okay, I want to go ahead. I want to explore though the talk radio thing that Scott said. You know, when talk radio unites and speaks with, you know, a unified voice and is defending a certain candidate, that we have found that to be very influential in primaries, not necessarily in general elections, in primaries. So I guess they're pro Doro, and then she has what Scott said is, you know, this asset coming out of the Waukesha Christmas parade trial. So Matt, you were speaking up, and I probably stepped on your thoughts, but you can say your thought and then comment on what but the question is, how influential will talk radio be in this primary?
Yeah, I'm back to the parade for a second, which I think all kinds of all ties together. I asked her, I said, I'm curious, like, are you getting comments about the parade in Western Wisconsin, in Northwestern Wisconsin, Northern Wisconsin, or is it just the Milwaukee metro? She goes, well, yeah, I mean, obviously Southeast Wisconsin is very heavily, but no matter where she goes, she says, whether it's the western part of the state, whether it's Superior, whether it's the northern part of the state, people know her because of that. Like, this was not just a Milwaukee or Waukesha trial. This was a trial that spanned the entire state and country. And I think, to what Chuck and Scott were just talking about, I think this is a test case, right? If Judge Protasewicz wins, it gives credence to her type of campaign she is running in terms of coming out and so forcefully talking about her values and positions, as opposed to the conservative candidates who are still discussing judicial independence and not giving public credence to their endorsements or who is behind them. I think as we look back at this moving forward, it could be the start of, I mean, we've talked about the last 20 years, right? It could be the start of a new way of campaigning for the courts that is already underway.
By the way, let me jump in. We tried that on the progressive side with Lisa Neubauer. She ran exactly that campaign that Matt's just talking about. And she lost not miserably, but she lost badly. And everyone's analysis after that was that campaign will never work again. And it hasn't. It is now partisan campaign. Let's be clear. This is never going to go back. And the other thing I would say with regard to what's going to happen in the general, even Tommy Thompson could not beat Tammy Baldwin after he was eviscerated in a primary from his own people. He came through the primary, but he was deeply wounded. Doral will be equally wounded as we go to the general election.
Okay, so how much though can talk radio in Milwaukee, is it influential enough to prop up Doro or defend her against negative attacks? I think, Scott, your answer was maybe. Does anybody else have a view on that?
I would defer to Scott's judgment on that.
Yeah, and to
You'd be a
Scott's point, I
strong
mean,
maybe then too, Chuck. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Matt.
I was gonna say we can Monday morning quarterback next week, right?
Okay. All right, you
but
guys
talk
are,
radio is powerful here in the state. It's unlike most other states where it is a very, very powerful voice among conservatives. And I think that's unique to the state.
Well, another thing I think we need to think about is who is turning out for the primary. So historically, in these primaries, it is much older voters. Those of us my age, and Chuck's age. These are people in their 60s and 70s who dominate these February primaries. I mean, in some communities, the turnout will be less than 5% because there's nothing else on the ballot. In other places, the turnout will be 20-30% because there's a hot race for mayor or a county executive or whatever, or a school board race. So the turnout is uneven. It is mostly older. It has normally been more conservative. It's been in the 4-year cycle. This February primary is normally the most conservative electorate. So to that extent, talk radio had more influence in those sort of races in the past. But talk radio's power has diminished, and it's not a statewide force, right? It's the eastern edge, at least, of the state. You're surprised how far you can hear those shows when you travel around the state, but it is mostly an impact on the eastern side of the state.
okay, so while since you mentioned that, other races, let's just briefly talk about the 8th Senate District primary. This is to fill, this race is a special election to fill the remainder of the term of longtime former GOP Senator Alberta Darling. So there's a 3-way GOP primary, and then there's no Democratic primary. There's just one Democratic candidate. Okay, so the primary is Tuesday in the northern Milwaukee suburbs. How does that influence this race, if at all, the Supreme Court race, if at all?
I think it goes the other way around. I think the Supreme Court race affects the 8th state Senate district race. So in that race, the primary is everything at this point. And I would have said 2 weeks ago was clearly Dan Knodel, the representative who has represented almost half of that state Senate district during the course of his career, who has more money and more name ID. He's likely to win this. But then, of course, Janelle Brandtjen benefits immensely from the Democrats entering the race and spending money trying to define her as the preferred conservative candidate. And then, of course, President Trump jumps into the race, and his endorsement doesn't take much money for everyone to find out about it, because he spreads it through social media, and it's a small crowd that needs to hear that. So I think the race at the top, to Protasewicz's strength, the money that the Democrats are spending there, that is more likely to influence and change that race. I still think it's likely to be Knodel, but Janelle Brandtjen has gotten a big benefit this week from the Democrats and from Donald Trump. An interesting pairing of people, by the way.
All right, Chuck, you were going to say something.
Well, just the Republicans specifically got this race timed up. They had the resignation time so that they would get this race coinciding, because what they're hoping to do is to drive turnout for the general election to help their candidate. With regard to the Senate race itself, if I would predict Knodel as well. In fact, I believe that the candidate for the Democrats understands that this is at least a 2-step process, where they run now, probably lose to Knodel in a special, and then probably come back in 2024. And my understanding is that there are even many Republicans who are saying they expect that person will lose the race. And by the way, if Judge Protasewicz wins the court, I expect we will have new maps in the fall of 2024 to run. And I think at that time, if there are new maps, the Democratic candidate will win at that time, even though the short term may be Knodel. I would defer to Scott's judgment as to whether he thinks Knodel or Brandtjen will win. I think the Democrats' view is if Brandtjen wins, then they have a real shot at winning this, even in the special election.
Right, and then Tim Michels in this district got 51%, so that also gives Democrats hope. I want to ask some questions from the audience now, and some of these audience questions that were submitted beforehand, I'm going to sort of summarize in a way. There's a lot of bemoaning of the partisan nature of the race, of the state Supreme Court race. And I guess my short answer is, well, if you elect judges, there's politics involved. Sorry, but how could I think I've heard we can't return to the old days, right? Is there a way to make our highest court less partisan?
Yes, Jeff, and let me jump in first because I was a person who 20 years ago saw this all coming. Scott, I'm sure, saw it coming too because he was involved in the Supreme Court races, which tells you already there was a partisan tint to them. What we should do is we should not elect Supreme Court justices. This is crazy. We should have one branch of government. The genius of our federal system is that we had one branch that was not subject to the partisan whims. What was the phrase? The heat and the whatever that came from that. We should have judges appointed because justices should not be. It's one thing what happens before they get elected. Well, once a justice to the Supreme Court is elected, I don't want them ever looking over their shoulder at what will happen in the next election because of their decision. I, as an attorney, but as a citizen, I want a neutral place to be able to go with somebody who's not elected who will make a decision based on the law, but also based on character and discipline and what are the right things to do for the person or for the case in front of them. I do not want them to worry that they have a really rich law firm that's on one side of the case and an individual on the other. The only way to change the system is to have appointed Supreme Court justices. It should be for one term of 15 years or something like that. And that is the only way to get away from it. I saw it coming more than 20 years ago. Proposed an alternative. There were people against it. And by the way, after they saw the partisanship, there were even some Supreme Court justices who came around to the view that maybe that's what we should be doing.
So I don't think the appointments will make a difference in regards to partisanship. I would argue that the federal process has shown us that, right? All those appointments in the U.S. Supreme Court, were they really nonpartisan? I don't think so. So whatever process you choose, it's going to end up being partisan because that's the way this world is at the moment with the level of polarization that we have. The higher the stakes, the more likely the parties will be involved in it. And the stakes are growing by leaps and bounds at the court level, both here at the state and the federal level. It's so important to Wisconsin's future. People are going to get involved and it will become partisan.
Okay, Corri or Matt, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard Janine Geske also talk a lot about appointing as opposed to elected. And Scott, yeah, to your point, I mean, I guess it just takes out the outside money, right, directly in terms of
quicker and cheaper.
It's right in terms of any type of campaigns. I talked with Justice Rogensack briefly, Jeff, actually after the WisPolitics forum, just about the political nature of the court. And it seems like almost every judge or justice, current or former, that you talk to is almost a little bit besides themselves in terms of how political and how polarized it has become. So a solution, I mean, it's anyone's guess at this point, right? In terms of how you go backwards, if that's even possible at all, or if you want to go backwards. It seems like Judge Protasewicz is capitalizing on the new era we are in, at least from a campaign strategy, right?
Right. There was a day, right? I think Prosser was unopposed, right?
Yes. And he was.
Think about that.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to go to this question. I'll take some fall for this. The questioner says, not a word on Judge Mitchell, the invisible man. Isn't that a tell? How can the Democratic Party progressives get away with that blatant disrespect, if not discrimination? Chuck, why don't you take that one?
That's a major failure for a person to say that. The reality is just what's on the ground, what's happening. I think Judge Mitchell is a very compassionate and good individual and a good judge, and I think he's doing everything he can to try to make things better for the people he has come before him. He is in the juvenile court and he does a really good job of trying to make these lives better before they get out there. And I respect him and admire that on his part. But the reality is that's not where the resources are. That's not where things are happening. There are some issues, some baggage out there that cause some problems. But the bottom line is that I think it's clear from our discussion today that this is a three-way race. And the big question is, I believe it's Janet Protasewicz is going to come through in the primary on the progressive end. It's a matter of who comes through on the other end, and then we have the general election. This is not to say anything negative about Judge Mitchell. In fact, I think Judge Mitchell is hopefully a model for what future juvenile court judges do. And hopefully when he gets to other elements of the court, as he will be switched around, he'll do great things there as well.
Yeah, I think a historical note, he would be the first African-American elected to the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Yes.
Wouldn't
we
be the
have one
first
pending.
African-American. Louis Butler was appointed by Jim Doyle, the governor, and then lost to Michael Gableman. So, yeah, which I think started the real partisanship, partisanized elections in Wisconsin, the court elections. Another question. Go ahead.
I was going to say quickly, I think Judge Mitchell, Jeff, to that point, has made a point that really resonates with a lot of people, that the court needs more diversity in 2023, diversity in opinion, diversity in the first elected African-American to the bench. So I think that's a conversation that he has started in earnest, and I think is going to continue as more races come up.
And by the way, let me point out that if we had appointments of Supreme Court justices, you would get that.
You probably wouldn't have 5 women on the court though, right? Or is it 6? 6 out of 7? The voters have been the ones who've been, to some extent, making the court more diverse than we've had in the past. The winning formula here seems to be a woman, right? Running for Supreme Court in this state.
Well, yeah, I mean, by the numbers on the court, you have to say that. And, and this is for Justice Pat Rogensack's seat. Okay, here's another question. Values are different than politics. Judge Mitchell, as I guess is another pro-Mitchell question. Judge Mitchell has articulated positions on values. The other liberal candidate is positioning in a purely political way, going for votes rather than on values. Isn't she? We asked about this before. And maybe Matt said this was like setting perhaps a new template for how Supreme Court races are run. Corri, what about this values? Is it okay for Supreme or what's the debate as you see it between for candidates to say what they really think and infer how they would rule?
Well, I mean, I think that they're walking a fine line when they do that, and the liberal candidates, I mean, Judge Protasewicz has used it to her advantage. Judge Doro has, one thing she has done when we've asked questions is she's kind of skirted and not answered, because she has said that any of these questions could come up before the Supreme Court. And Judge Kelly has given these answers based on the Constitution. So really, the Judge Protasewicz and Judge Mitchell have talked about values. And as far as the Judge Mitchell question, as far our coverage, we have talked about Judge Mitchell, but our coverage has kind of stopped a little bit because of just where the narrative has gone in the race. And
fundraising isn't everything, but
fundraising isn't, but he hasn't really been out and about as much either. So I think that's just with that question about Judge Mitchell, that's what's happened with the race.
Okay, here's another question.
It is an example that Judge Protasewicz, it's amazing. She is a tireless campaigner. I have never seen most of my legislative candidates that I've had and others that I've seen in the assembly campaign as hard as she is. She's out there all the time, everywhere.
Okay, so here's another question along these lines. With the increasing distrust of the federal judiciary or the judiciary in general, are the candidates well advised to act more nonpartisan and otherwise to risk having to recuse themselves in cases with conflict or perceived conflict? So, I guess somebody could say if the abortion case comes before the Supreme Court, somebody could say if Protasewicz is elected, well, you should recuse yourself, right? Somebody could ask that, right?
But the judges get to make that decision themselves. So it isn't like there's a neutral authority that says you crossed the line or that you have a conflict And therefore you have to step aside. The individual judge makes the decision themselves as to whether or not they recuse.
And to that point, it's interesting that Protasiewicz has talked about recusal rules and new rules for the court. The other three really have shied away from that when asked about that. But you then not only look to issues, but you look to money and endorsements, and it becomes very messy very quickly, especially in the state of affairs today.
Yeah, I mean, the pro-life groups have given money to both conservative candidates. So it would be, like Matt said, very messy with recusal on that issue for sure.
Okay,
I think
Jeff,
most of the
man.
judges think I'm objective. Once they're elected, right? They're like, I can be objective in this case. And even though other people say, well, wait a minute, you already said where you were going to go on this case. People, no, I'm objective. I'm objective. So
They're all the
never
most
recuse
objective.
themselves. I mean, and they all try to narrow the recusal to that contribution was 6 years ago. It doesn't matter. So apparently if it was last week, then it mattered. But, you know, they all, when you hear their arguments on the rare occasions when someone recuses themselves, it's because it's, you know, my nephew is arguing the case before us. It's a very rare thing.
Another argument for an appointed Supreme Court.
They would still have conflicts too.
Okay, Jeff Mandel is setting the record straight here. Thank you, Jeff. He's listening in here. He says, note that Justice Hagedorn was elected over a female candidate, Lisa Neubauer. Yeah, correct. And also note that you don't have to go back to Prosser to find an unopposed election. Ziegler was reelected without an opponent. I guess I went to Prosser because he was a political figure. Like, you know, he was a Republican leader in the assembly like Scott Jensen was. So it was like, wow, you know, but again, times change. I don't think we're ever going to have
Babbage, right?
Yeah, right.
We've had others. Yeah.
Yeah,
but all those folks got bipartisan endorsements at some point during their campaign. I mean,
yeah.
I crafted television ads, as I said, with both a Democrat and a Republican governor endorsing my candidate for the Supreme Court. That just is not going to happen ever again, I think, in this state.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a bygone era, essentially. Okay, you know, Scott talked before about, you know, Supreme Court races and who comes to vote in Supreme Court races. You know, the Karofsky Kelly race was hyped a little bit because it coincided with a presidential primary, even though there wasn't much of a primary going on. But at any rate, there was still a primary. But, you know, this good questioner says, what's the most effective tool to get more eligible Gen Z voters to the poll for the first time in April for this Supreme Court election here in Wisconsin, in particular, Gen Zs of color? Why don't we talk to Chuck on that one?
Well, one of the things that both parties are doing now is trying to put on referenda that will make a difference. Democrats have been involved in putting referenda questions on for Governor Evers related to marijuana. So this spring in April, not only will voters be voting on a Supreme Court candidate, but they will be voting, if you're in Milwaukee County, Dane County, or Eau Claire County, on an abortion question, which will drive people out. I expect you'll see more people from the Eau Claire campus turning out for that. I do believe you'll have seen some additional African-American turnout from that, but that will hopefully drive younger Gen Z voters out to the polls. And while they are there, guess who they're voting for in that spring election for Supreme Court? It will be for Protasiewicz. So there's that. The Republicans are trying to get bail on, and there's some challenge to that, and they're hoping that they will be able to message around. In fact, do not be surprised that you see not only hundreds of thousands, but millions of dollars spent by Republicans to generate interest in voting on that, because they hope that when they arrive and vote on bail, they'll do that. However, I think the problem Republicans have on that issue is that Protasiewicz is actually pretty good on crime. And I think it's very competitive with the Republicans on that, which is better for us as Democrats than what we've had in the past. She has been a prosecutor for many years before she was a judge. But those are the kinds of things, I think driving issues is what helps with those voters. But historically, these are really low turnout elections. And by and large, that really helps Republicans. Although I think that's changing because the suburbs and the wealthier individuals, the college educated, are now leaning more toward the person who's going to give them the personal freedom to make a decision about their family, their daughter, their wife, or the woman themselves, even better, of course, to make a decision about abortion. That's going to drive the issue this spring.
Anybody else want to weigh in on, you know, making this a more diverse electorate, the Supreme Court race? You know, I think Kevin Kennedy used to be at the old elections board, said, well, there's something that drives turnout, interest, and what interest in the race, spending on advertising, and voters, so voters know about it. And then it's a close election or it's an important election. The stakes are high, right? These elements are taking place in this election. So I don't know.
I think it will be a very high turnout, Jeff, in the general election. By the time you get to that general election in April, if we're going to spend, I think, almost $10 million here in the primary, all sides included, that they got to spend at least double that in the general, right? So, I mean, this is going to be a $30-40 million race for Wisconsin State Supreme Court. Also, the more negative a race gets, the higher the turnout. I know that startles people and they say, oh, no, negative ads turn people off. No. Negative ads get people angry. Negative ads get people emotional, and they turn out to vote. So I think all that money, all that negativity is likely in April to see a much higher than the 28% or 30% turnout that you would normally see in a spring election.
I agree. I think we're hearing, $20,000 or $20 million for each side, by the time we get to the general. So that's going to, all of that, people are going to be hearing about this race more and more, and they're going to turn out for the general for sure. And I even think for the primary, places like Milwaukee, Dane County, like you brought up, Chuck, Eau Claire, they're going to turn out. And conservatives, I think, too, will turn out for this race. I mean, especially with the two conservative candidates, people are interested, I think.
Well, and listen, the parties are treating this more as political campaigns than ever before, just with the campaign infrastructure, the resources they're pouring in, the get out, the vote effort on the ground behind the scenes, not only from the campaigns, but the parties. I think naturally will potentially, their hope is to drive more turnout just because of the nature of how they're campaigning this.
But with all of that said, it will not reach gubernatorial turnout. With all of that said, it'll be bigger than usual spring elections, but never get to a governor or presidential level.
Well, I think we ought to double down, Chuck, and why we should make these races in November.
I am all for that, Jeff. Let's do that. Can we have this group decide that and put that into law?
Matt and I can't handle that. No.
All right. So it's already been vetoed. That's too much. All right. Well, we've had a great
people on this one.
Yeah, we've had a great discussion here, folks. So the primary's on Tuesday. You can go to the Wisconsin Elections Board site and you can find out where to go to vote. You can go to WisPolitics.com and you can see our election guide. And you can also tune into shows like The Insiders. We'll have a new one on Friday about this very race. So with all that, I want to thank Chuck Qualla, Scott Jensen, Corri Hess, and Matt Smith for being part of this virtual luncheon on the State Supreme Court primary. I want to thank our sponsor, of course, Tom G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. This is Jeff Mayer signing off for now, and we'll see you next time.